The message came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I read it 4 times before I let myself believe it was real. I need to talk to you. It's about Noah. It's important, Michael. Please. My name is Michael. I'm 38 years old. I install commercial HVAC systems for a living. And until that Tuesday night, I hadn't heard my ex-wife's voice in over 3 years. Melissa and I were married for 6 years. We've been divorced for 7. And somewhere in that gap, apparently, a truth had been sitting quietly, waiting for the right, or the worst, moment to surface. I stared at my phone in the dark of my kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The particular cold that comes right before your life changes and you don't yet know how. I didn't text back that night. I told myself I needed to think. What I actually did was sit at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, turning her words over like a stone I couldn't put down. It's about Noah. I didn't know who Noah was. I had no reason to know who Noah was. That's what made it unbearable. The not knowing, stitched together with the certainty that whatever it was going to cost me something. I want to back up, though, because you can't understand what that message did to me unless you understand who I was before it landed. I met Melissa when I was 28. She had a laugh that filled up a room and a way of looking at you like you were the only interesting thing in it, at least at first. We got married 18 months later in her parents' backyard, string lights in the trees, and I remember standing there thinking I had won something. I was the kind of husband who came home and asked about her day before I even took off my boots. I picked up extra shifts so she could quit the job she hated and figure out what she actually wanted to do. I thought that was love. I thought if I gave enough, was steady enough, present enough, it would be impossible for anything to go wrong. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. That was only the first. 6 years into the marriage, on a Thursday afternoon that started like any other, Melissa packed an overnight bag for what she called a girls' weekend, with 2 friends I'd met maybe twice. She kissed me goodbye at the door, quick, a little too quick, her eyes already somewhere else, and told me she'd be back Sunday night. I didn't think anything of it. Not really. Not yet. But if you've ever had a moment where some small, wordless part of you registers that something is wrong before your conscious mind catches up, you already know what I mean. I stood in the doorway a beat too long after her car pulled away, and I couldn't have told you why. I didn't know it yet, but that quick kiss goodbye wasn't the last thing that weekend would cost me. The weeks before that Thursday had felt, in hindsight, unremarkable in a way that should have troubled me more than it did. Melissa had started running in the evenings, a new habit, she said, something to clear her head. I remember being glad for her. She'd seemed restless for months, snapping at small things, sighing at the dishes in a way that felt aimed at more than dishes. I thought the running was good for her. I thought a lot of things were good for her that, looking back, were really just her stepping further out of the life we were building. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a marriage when one person has already started leaving. Maybe you know it. Maybe you felt a version of it. A spouse, a friend, a parent, someone whose body is still in the room, but whose attention has already gone somewhere else. I didn't have a name for it then. I just knew that dinner conversations had gotten shorter, and that she'd started keeping her phone face down on the counter, screen turned away from me, in a way she never used to. I noticed. I want to be honest about that. I noticed, and I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know. I told myself I trusted her, and that asking would somehow be an insult to that trust. The truth, the uglier truth, is that I was afraid of what asking might open up. It was easier to believe everything was fine than to risk finding out it wasn't. That was my mistake, if I'm naming it plainly. Not the affair, that was never mine to own. But the not asking. The choosing comfort over clarity, again and again, because clarity felt like it might cost me the whole life I'd built around her. One night, about 3 weeks before the trip, I came home early from a job that finished ahead of schedule. Melissa was on the back porch, phone pressed to her ear, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months. Bright, unguarded, easy. The second she saw me through the sliding door, the laugh cut off mid-breath, and she said, "Too fast. I'll call you back," and hung up before I'd even asked who it was. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Just Christina," she said. "From the gym." I didn't know a Christina from the gym. I let it go. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when Melissa mentioned offhand that she hadn't been to that gym in over a month. Small inconsistency. A name that didn't line up with a place. On its own, it meant nothing. I filed it away in the part of my mind reserved for things too small to matter, not realizing that part of my mind was slowly filling up with things that, together, would matter enormously. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever stood in your own kitchen, doing something as ordinary as loading a dishwasher, and felt a wrongness in the air you couldn't point to or explain, you already know the particular loneliness of that feeling. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there in your chest, low and persistent, while you keep loading plates like nothing's happening at all. The Thursday of the girls' weekend arrived a week after that. I helped her carry her bag to the car. I told her to have fun. She hugged me at the door. Quick, her body angled slightly away from mine, a kiss that landed more on my cheek than my mouth, and said, "Love you, be good," in the same tone you'd use with a coworker. I stood in the doorway after her car turned the corner, and something in my chest had gone tight in a way I couldn't name. I told myself it was nothing. I went back inside and watched TV alone and told myself, more than once, that I was being paranoid. If I had trusted that feeling in my chest instead of talking myself out of it, some things that came later might have gone differently. But I didn't. Not yet. Melissa came back from the weekend on Sunday night, and something about her had shifted in a way I couldn't articulate. She was lighter, somehow, humming while she unpacked, distracted in a way that looked almost like happiness, except it never once turned toward me. I asked how the trip was. "Good," she said, not looking up from folding a shirt. "Relaxing. What did you guys do?" "Just hung out. Talked." "You know." I didn't know. That was the problem. Every answer she gave me was technically true and completely empty, and I was starting to understand, somewhere underneath the part of me still trying to believe her, that emptiness was its own kind of answer. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Another weekend trip, shorter this time. Just Christina and me, girl time. A phone that stayed face down. A new perfume I didn't recognize, worn on ordinary Tuesdays for no occasion I could name. I noticed all of it. I said nothing about most of it. One evening, I found a receipt in the pocket of her jacket while I was doing laundry. A hotel, 2 hours away, dated the weekend of that first girls' trip. I stood there in the laundry room holding it for a long moment, my thumb running over the printed numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. I didn't ask her about it that night. I told myself I needed more before I said anything. That one receipt could have 100 explanations, that confronting her without proof would only make me look paranoid, jealous, small. I put it back in the jacket pocket exactly where I found it and said nothing. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding. I had the beginning of an answer already in my hand, and I chose silence because silence felt safer than the truth. I understand now that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you think you can afford to pay. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was what Melissa had been carrying during those same weeks. She told me, much later, what those weekends had actually been like from her side. I told myself it was just this once. That's the lie you tell yourself the first time, and somehow you keep telling it every time after that. Like saying it again makes it truer. Daniel and I had known each other since high school, before Michael, before any of it, and when I ran into him again that spring, it felt like stepping into an old version of myself I'd forgotten existed. I told myself I deserved to feel that again. I told myself Michael would never have to know, that it would burn itself out, that I could hold both lives at once if I was careful enough. Every time I drove those 2 hours back home, I practiced my face in the rearview mirror until it looked normal again. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Instead, in real time, I did what people do when they'd rather not know. I found small reassurances. She still made my coffee in the mornings. She still asked about my day, even if the answers she gave to my questions had gotten thinner. I told myself a woman having an affair wouldn't still do those things. I was wrong about that too. People can hold two entirely different lives in their hands at once, and most of the time, one of those lives looks exactly like nothing has changed. Then came the phone call. I was in the garage, looking for a socket wrench, when Melissa's phone, left behind on the kitchen counter for once, an accident I don't think she meant, buzzed with a text preview I wasn't trying to see, but saw anyway. Can't stop thinking about last weekend. When can I see you again? The name on the screen wasn't Christina. I stood there in the garage doorway for what felt like a very long time, the wrench still in my hand, feeling the floor of my life tilt slightly beneath me. I didn't say anything to her that night. I told myself I was still gathering pieces, still building a picture I could confront her with cleanly, without falling apart in front of her. The truth was simpler and less noble than that. I was terrified, and I wasn't ready. If I had said something that night instead of 3 weeks later, everything that followed would have gone differently. For the next several weeks, I became someone I didn't recognize, a man quietly cataloging his own marriage for evidence of its ending. I checked credit card statements late at night after Melissa had gone to bed, looking for hotel charges, gas station stops, and places she had no reason to be. I found a pattern of small, repeated charges at a coffee shop 2 towns over, always on days she told me she was running errands. I never confronted her with any single piece. I told myself I needed the whole picture before I said a word, that walking in with half an answer would only let her explain it away. Some of that was strategy. Some of it, I understand now, was fear dressed up as patience. It was around this time that a woman named Christina, a real one, not the invented alibi Melissa had been using her name for, reached out to me directly on Facebook. I didn't know her. Her message started simply, "I think you need to see this." Christina, it turned out, was Daniel's wife, or had been, until that same week, when she'd found what I was only starting to suspect. She'd found it the way people usually do, a phone left unlocked, a message that shouldn't have been there. And in the wreckage of her own marriage falling apart, she'd found my name, found Melissa's, and decided I deserved to know what she now knew too. She sent screenshots, messages between Daniel and Melissa going back nearly 4 months, since before that first girls' weekend, which I now understood had never involved Christina from the gym at all. There were photos. There was a shared history between Melissa and Daniel that went back further than our marriage. High school sweethearts, apparently, who'd found their way back to each other and never bothered to mention it to either spouse standing in the way. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, reading messages between my wife and a man I'd never met, feeling something in me go very quiet and very still. Not rage, not yet. Something closer to the moment right before a wave breaks. That suspended second where you know exactly what's coming and there's nothing left to do but wait for it. Even now, remembering that night, something uncomfortable stirs in my chest. Not the anger, the stillness. I think that stillness was the last few minutes I had left of the life I thought I was living. I want to pause here, because this is where the story could have gone somewhere else entirely. I thought, briefly, about saying nothing, about waiting, watching, letting her keep believing I didn't know, just to see how long the lie could hold. Some part of me wanted the upper hand that silence would give me. I decided against it, not out of nobility. I simply didn't have it in me to live one more day pretending. There was a complication I hadn't accounted for, though, and it came from an unexpected direction. Our son, I should say now, the son I believed at the time was only ever going to be our son in the sense of the family I'd hoped we'd someday build, not yet knowing what I was actually walking toward. No, I need to correct myself here, the way the truth eventually corrected me. At this point in the story, there was no son yet. Melissa and I had talked about children, had tried, without success, during our marriage. That failure had been its own quiet grief between us. One more thing I'd absorbed without asking enough questions about how she was carrying it. What I didn't know, standing in my kitchen at 1 in the morning with Christina's screenshots open in front of me, was that Melissa had left our marriage already pregnant, and that for reasons she would only explain 7 years later, she had never told me. That detail seemed insignificant to me at the time, because I didn't have it yet. It wasn't insignificant. It was the whole second half of this story, sitting quietly in the future, waiting. I called Melissa's phone. She didn't pick up. I texted her 4 words, "Come home. We need to talk." She thought that message could wait until morning. It couldn't. Melissa came home a little after 9 the next morning, moving through the front door with the particular carefulness of someone who already suspects the ground has shifted but hasn't been told exactly how far. I was sitting at the kitchen table where I'd been for most of the night. Christina's screenshots printed and stacked in front of me like evidence in a trial I'd never wanted to be part of. "Michael, what's going on?" "Sit down." She sat. I watched her eyes go to the papers on the table, watched the color leave her face in real time as she understood, before I said a single word, exactly what this was. "How long?" I said. Not a question, really. A demand dressed as one. It's not what you think. Melissa. My voice cracked on her name, and I hated that it did. How long? The silence that followed lasted long enough that I almost stood up and walked out of my own kitchen. Then something in her seemed to give way all at once, like a wall that had been holding back more pressure than it could bear. For months, she said. Almost 5. Daniel. Her head snapped up. You know his name? His wife told me. She found out the same way I did, by accident, from somebody else. That's how little you two thought this through. She started crying then, but I want to be honest. My first instinct wasn't sympathy. It was something colder. Don't, I said, when she reached toward my hand across the table. Don't do that right now. What came out of her next wasn't an apology. It was closer to an accusation, delivered through tears. You have no idea what it's been like, Michael. Being married to someone so safe, so predictable. I used to lie awake wondering if this was going to be my whole life. Every day, the same. You, the same. I felt like I was disappearing. So you found someone else to disappear with instead. You were just boring, she said, quietly, like she'd been holding the words for a long time and finally let them fall. I didn't want boring. I wanted to feel something again. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. 6 years of showing up, of trying, of believing that steady was the same thing as good, reduced to a single word she'd apparently been carrying against me the entire time. Get out, I said. Michael, please, let me explain. You just did. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. I want you out of this house by tonight. I don't want to hear from Daniel. I don't want to hear his name again unless it's from a lawyer, and I don't ever want to hear the word boring out of your mouth again like it's an excuse for what you did. She left that afternoon. She didn't fight it. There was no scene, no dramatic reconciliation attempt, just the quiet, devastating efficiency of someone who had already, somewhere inside herself, left months before her body finally followed. I didn't know it yet, but the word boring wasn't the last thing she'd leave behind that day. What I also didn't know, what wouldn't surface for 7 more years, was that Melissa had left our marriage carrying something she hadn't told me, hadn't told Daniel with certainty either, and had decided, in the chaos of that final week, to carry alone into whatever came next. The divorce moved quickly after that. There was no fight over the house. She didn't want it. Said too much of it reminded her of a version of her life she was trying to leave behind. There was no custody battle, no long legal war. Just paperwork, signatures, and the strange anticlimax of watching a 6-year marriage end with a notary's stamp instead of a scene. I didn't hear from her again for 7 years. The Tuesday night message that opened this story sat in my phone for 2 days before I answered it. I need to talk to you. It's about Noah. It's important, Michael. Please. I finally called her back on a Thursday evening, sitting in my truck in a grocery store parking lot, because I couldn't make myself have this conversation inside my own house. She answered on the second ring, and her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, worn down in a way 7 years apparently does to a person. Thank you for calling, she said. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. What's going on, Melissa? There was a long breath on the other end of the line. I have a son. He's 7. His name is Noah. A pause. I think he might be yours. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after she said it. Engine off, groceries I never bought forgotten entirely, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the past reaching forward and taking hold of the present with both hands. I need you to say that again, I said finally. Slowly. She did. And then, because I asked, because for the first time in 7 years I actually wanted the whole truth instead of protecting myself from it. She gave me the rest of it, in her own words, the way she'd apparently been rehearsing it in her head for longer than she let on. She finally spoke. This is what she told me. It started small. Daniel and I reconnecting felt harmless at first. Just 2 people from the same hometown catching up over coffee. I told myself that's all it was, right up until the moment it wasn't. And even then I told myself it was just this once, that it would burn itself out before it cost me anything. It didn't. I kept choosing it, weekend after weekend, and every time I drove home, I told myself a different version of the same lie. That I could hold both lives, that Michael would never have to know, that this was just something I needed for myself, and it didn't take anything away from him. I was so afraid of being caught that I started rehearsing my own face in mirrors. And underneath the fear was something worse. I didn't recognize who I was becoming. And some nights I'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror and not be able to look myself in the eye. When you found out, some part of me was almost relieved because I didn't have to keep lying anymore. But I left that day already suspecting I was pregnant, and I didn't say anything. Not to you. Not even to Daniel. Not really. Because I was terrified of what it would mean either way. If Noah was yours, I didn't think I deserved to ask you to be part of that after what I'd done. If he was Daniel's, I was terrified of building a family on top of the wreckage I'd already made. So I said nothing. I told myself I'd figure it out later. Later became years. I couldn't look at Noah's drawings on the refrigerator some mornings without feeling sick, because I knew I was the reason he might never get to know his real father. Daniel and I didn't last? Not really. The same thing that let him choose me over Christina eventually let him choose someone else over me. I've been raising Noah mostly alone. And I know I don't get to ask you for this. But he's 7 now, and he asks questions I can't answer honestly anymore. And I couldn't keep lying to him the way I lied to you. I didn't say anything for a long moment after she finished. The parking lot lights had come on outside my truck, and I watched people pushing carts through the fluorescent dark, living lives that had nothing to do with the one currently rearranging itself in my chest. I want a DNA test, I said finally, before anything else happens. I need to know for certain. I understand, she said. I'll set it up. Whatever you need. The test came back 3 weeks later. Noah was mine. I met him for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in a park, on neutral ground, with Melissa standing several feet back the way you'd stand back from something fragile you weren't sure you were allowed to touch yet. Noah was cautious with me at first. 7-year-olds are good at sensing when adults are carrying something heavy, even if they can't name what it is. He asked me if I liked dinosaurs. I told him I did. That was enough, that day, to start with. Daniel, for what it's worth, did not take the DNA results well. There were a few tense phone calls, a lawyer's letter about visitation rights he had no legal claim to, an attempt to insert himself back into a story he'd already forfeited his place in by choosing, eventually, to leave Melissa the same way he'd once helped her leave me. He doesn't factor much into what happened after. That's its own kind of consequence. The man who blew up 2 marriages ended up with neither the family he broke into nor the one he left behind. Melissa lost more than a marriage that day. I found the screenshots on my kitchen table. She lost 7 years of her son knowing his father. She lost the version of herself she might have respected had she chosen honesty instead of a decade of quiet self-protection. When she finally told me the truth, it wasn't out of triumph or relief. It was out of exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of someone who has run out of road on a lie that started small and grew into the whole shape of her life. I've spent the months since rebuilding something I didn't expect to be rebuilding at 40. Not a marriage, but a fatherhood I never knew I had. Noah stays with me every other weekend now. He likes dinosaurs and terrible jokes, and asking me questions about what I was like when I was his age. Some Saturdays, when I watch him fall asleep on my couch halfway through a movie, I think about the 6 years I spent trying to be good enough to keep a marriage that had already quietly ended long before I found out about it. And I think about how strange it is that the best thing left standing in the wreckage of all that was something I didn't even know existed until 7 years after the fact. I understand something now that I didn't back then. I hadn't been building a marriage in those 6 years. I'd been maintaining the appearance of one and telling myself that was the same thing. I mistook giving everything for being enough. I mistook not asking hard questions for trust, when really it was fear wearing trust's clothes. Melissa and I are not friends. We're not enemies either, not anymore. We're 2 people who share a son and have agreed, carefully, to be decent to each other for his sake. That's not forgiveness, exactly. It's something quieter and more useful than forgiveness. It's coexistence with clear eyes. The word she used that day in my kitchen still surfaces sometimes, usually late at night, when I'm not expecting it. You were just boring. For a long time it sat in me like an accusation I hadn't earned the right to argue with. Now, when it comes back, it doesn't have the same weight. Boring, it turns out, was never really about me. It was about a restlessness in her that had nothing to do with who I was and everything to do with who she was still trying to become. I've stopped carrying it as a verdict on my worth. I've started carrying it, instead, as proof that I was never the one who needed to change. Noah asked me last weekend, out of nowhere, while we were building a dinosaur out of blocks, whether I was mad at his mom. Not anymore. I told him, and I realized, saying it out loud, that it was true. He nodded like that answer satisfied something in him, and went back to building. I sat there on the floor of my living room, watching my son stack blocks into something that would probably fall over in a minute, and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that resembled peace. The most painful detail in this story isn't the affair itself. It's the 7 years of silence that followed it. The years a father didn't know his son existed because two people separately decided that not knowing was easier to live with than the truth. Michael's blindness in the marriage and Melissa's silence after it are, in a strange way, mirror images of the same failure. Both of them chose comfortable ignorance over difficult honesty at different points, for different reasons, and both paid for it in years they can't get back. What makes this story more than a simple betrayal narrative is the way the consequences don't arrive on anyone's schedule. Michael doesn't get closure the day Melissa leaves. He gets it, if he gets it at all, 7 years later, in a park, watching a 7-year-old ask him about dinosaurs. Melissa doesn't face the reckoning for her affair when Christina's messages land on Michael's laptop. She faces it slowly, over years of watching her son grow up asking questions she couldn't answer, until the weight of the lie became heavier than the fear of the truth. There's a pattern worth naming here about the difference between an ending and a resolution. Michael's marriage ended cleanly and quickly, signatures, a notary stamp, no drawn-out war. But nothing was actually resolved that day. The real reckoning, for both of them, took 7 more years to arrive, because the truth that mattered most, Noah's existence, was buried under fear on Melissa's side and buried under grief and self-protection on Michael's. Endings are often just the moment two people stop performing a life together. Resolution is much slower, and it usually requires someone, eventually, to stop protecting themselves and start telling the truth. It's also worth sitting with what Melissa's confession reveals about the nature of self-deception. She didn't set out to destroy two families. She told herself, at every stage, a smaller, more survivable version of what she was doing. Just this once, he'll never know. It doesn't take anything from him. Betrayal rarely announces itself as betrayal in the moment it's happening. It arrives dressed as something smaller and more forgivable, and it's only in hindsight, or in confession, that its true size becomes visible. I keep coming back to one thing from this story. How much of the damage here didn't come from the affair itself, but from what both of them did with the truth afterward. One running from it, one drowning it in silence for 7 years. That's usually where the real cost of betrayal lives, in the years of not saying, not the moment of not being faithful. I think about how easy it is, in any relationship, to mistake giving everything for being enough, to believe that showing up, staying steady, never asking the hard question, is the same thing as real intimacy. It isn't. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone, or for yourself, is ask the question you're afraid of the answer to. If there's a quiet takeaway here, it's this: the truth costs something no matter when it arrives. But it almost always costs less than the years spent avoiding it. Michael got 7 years back, eventually, in the form of a son who likes dinosaurs and terrible jokes. It wasn't the ending either of them expected, but it was, in its own imperfect way, worth arriving at. I don't know what you're carrying tonight, or what truth you've been putting off telling someone, or yourself, but maybe that's worth sitting with for a minute, before you go back to whatever you were doing before this story found you.